Tesla does things a little bit differently, and without a standard press or communications team, when they release a new product, it's not widely available for the media to go take a look. So what I did is waited for one to show up in my local showroom. So join me while I take some time out of my slightly extended drive to tell you more about the updated Tesla Model 3 performance. I'll apologize in advance for this car being a little bit dirty, but there's only so much I can do with limited time. What hasn't had limited time, luckily, is going to be this performance model. It took a long time for Tesla to update the Model 3, and this performance model was not too far behind, but it was differentiated a little bit. And visually, we now have a different looking Model 3. And for folks who are paying a premium for a performance model, having it look the part, I think, is a big piece of that puzzle. From about here down is where you're going to notice the biggest difference. Now, I will start by saying that these headlights really do lend themselves to a performance model. They're a lot more sleek, they're a little more aggressive than we got in the previous model, and that really does carry forward and just emphasize the performance-oriented functions of at least this particular model. But down below, the biggest difference is going to be this front splitter. And it's not incredibly aggressive, but it is going to be painted a different color. That helps it stand out. It's not going to be a gloss black. It's sort of a semi-gloss. And it's not carbon fiber, which is going to help on cost, but we do see some carbon fiber bits on the interior and the rear. Those obviously scream performance model. The one thing we do get that is going to be maybe aerodynamically a little bit more different than the standard models is going to be the inlets here on the side. And there is somewhat of an aerodynamic treatment, although the lines here are all very similar. And according to Tesla, the dimensions, at least the width, are the exact same from model to model. But this feels lower, wider, and more planted. While the width may stay the same across the lineup, this comes in at a whopping 0.1 inches longer than the rest of the Model 3s. And most of that probably comes from that front splitter. The more impactful difference is going to be in ride height, where this does sit about 0.4 inches closer to the ground, meaning that we do have less ground clearance, but we also have a lower center of gravity. And with some of the other component changes that we get on this model, that's really going to benefit you if you're trying to get out and drive in a more spirited fashion. But the other thing that comes along with the size of this car is that for a mid-size sedan, it's on the small side. And when you look at a performance option, especially a performance electric car in this price range, what this competes against is less sedans and more crossovers. Specifically, the first things that come to mind, and I think the most things people will be shopping against this, are the Kia EV6 GT and the Hyundai Ioniq 5N. And if we call those different ends of the spectrum, this Model 3 is going to fit pretty squarely in the middle, but we'll cover a little bit more of that later. The fact of the matter is that dimensionally, this is just about exactly what you'd expect from the rest of the Model 3 lineup, but you do get a lot for the space that's made available. Wheels and tires come one way, that's 20 inches all the way around, 235 for the front, 275 for the rear. And while this isn't the biggest offset nor the most aggressive rear tire, it does show a dedication to performance, because when you do a staggered layout, you do lose some practicality, at least financial practicality, since you can't rotate these tires. As far as the tires, we're going with Pirelli P0s, so a fairly aggressive performance tread, and your braking is going to be done by some upgraded brakes and braking pads, again, just a little bit farther away from the rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive Model 3s. That said, they could have gone for a more aggressive layout, and the fact that this still has 341 rated range, which is probably going to be a little on the optimistic side, but it is going to be a big gap from the other options that we'll talk about when we start driving, because they are going to be leaning a little more towards performance. However, the fact is that this car has just over 500 horsepower, and this is going to be able to get all that down when you need it. From behind is going to be the easiest way to tell that this is a performance car, but what the biggest standout is, I'll let you decide. Let me know down in the comments below. Up top is the carbon fiber spoiler, which is very sporty, but it's also pretty sleek and a little bit understated. And from the side, it definitely complements the body lines of this vehicle, so good placement on that spoiler. One of the more confusing pieces is going to be the badging there. The bottom right is the plaid badge, or what looks a lot like the plaid badge, but this is not a plaid model. This is a performance model. We don't have the plaid rating, so I'm not entirely sure what that badge is doing there, but there it is nonetheless. Down below is going to be, I think, one of the biggest standouts, and that's going to be the rear diffuser. Now, this rear diffuser is in the same semi-gloss as we get in the front. Again, that's a color I like and does work very well with this white. but it is still pretty understated. It does speak, however, to some of the aerodynamic design that's gone into this car that does differentiate itself from the rest of the lineup and says, hey, this is designed to go a little bit faster. And while I wouldn't necessarily call this a track-oriented vehicle, it's definitely gonna do a lot better on the track than other models and even some of the competition. There's a track mode, and unfortunately I won't get to test that out today. Either way, it's got the look, but one of the confusing pieces for me is going to be in these rear taillights. Now don't get me wrong, I like this design, and with how stretched out everything here is, especially on this model, I think it looks really, really good. But what's a little bit confusing is the fact that they changed the design so much from the last model, meaning that if we open this up, our entire light assembly goes with it, meaning that we now have to have a repeater down below, which pops on as soon as you open that trunk. But for me, that just seemed a little bit unnecessary, although I'm not an engineer and I like the design, so either way, I'll go ahead and take it. But speaking of this rear storage, there is quite a bit of it. Now this opening is pretty large. I'll go ahead and take my stuff out of here. According to Tesla, we have 24 cubic feet of total storage capacity. And I imagine what we're talking about is this space, because there is more. Down below here is a pretty large cargo cubby, which could definitely fit my backpack no problem. If you have something a little bit harder sided, that would be a little bit more difficult to do. But either way, there's a lot of storage space. And as you can see, a pretty wide storage opening. Extra storage doesn't just exist in the rear, it also exists here in the front. Not only could I fit that carry-on bag under the floor, but I can also fit it here under this front trunk. The heart of this car is a dual motor layout capable of 510 total horsepower. And that'll get this 0 to 60 in as low as 3 seconds flat. Now, all of that power comes from a 78 kilowatt hour battery, which is going to be on the smaller side, but Tesla still says it's going to be good enough for 341 total miles of driving range. Now, Tesla numbers seem to be a little bit more optimistic than others, but this is a noticeable step higher than some of the competition. And one of the things the competition also has, not only bigger batteries, but also more horsepower. But the fact of the matter is that they're not as quick 0 to 60 as this is, and a lot of that comes down to weight. Some of those even have more aggressive tires, but they're heavier. And we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds heavier. And that really is going to factor into how quickly you can get 0 to 60 and also 60 down to 0. The next place we'll see carbon fiber is going to be here on the interior. And that's going to be this one carbon strip we find on this gently tiered dashboard. And by gently tiered, I mean that there aren't really big leaps between different levels here on the dashboard. But if you look here, there are going to be a couple different, let's say, half levels. Now, just like every other Tesla, your vents are going to be here. They're going to be a slot design, and that's going to be controlled here in the center console. Now, the strip above that is going to be new to this model, not just the performance, but the updated Model 3, where you have a light strip here that runs along the outside there. It's not going to be something I can show you here in the daytime, but I do promise it's there, and it runs all the way through basically where that silver strip is, all the way around to the back. That gently tiered layout is going to carry here through the doors. Up top here is going to be the same synthetic that you get in the armrest. That's going to match whatever the interior color is of your vehicle. And then here you're going to get a slightly synthetic feeling suede. Either way, pretty nice materials, but one of the things we've come to expect from Teslas is a pretty minimalistic design. If I reach back over to that center screen, I can go ahead and open our glove box. Not an enormous glove box, more of a slot style, but there is enough room for, at least in this case, the owner's manual, maybe a few small items, but it is going to be a little bit bigger of a flap than we got in the previous model. It'll go ahead and open from the center console, but you have to go ahead and close itself, and it feels like it's magnets that are holding that in, so that's an interesting touch. Let's take a closer look here at the center screen. Now this one is in demo mode, so some of this might look a little bit different after you purchase yours, but in the bottom left-hand corner is going to be where you activate most of the settings. And the first things that are going to pop up are going to be the things you need most readily. And that's going to be things like your mirror controls, folding them, changing your lights, that sort of thing. All of that's going to be pretty readily available. Until you need more, that's when you would start diving into the rest of the menu. Now, dynamics is going to be a big one here for this particular model because it's the performance model. So we have a little bit more when it comes to the acceleration options. Instead of chill, standard, we also get insane. And this is one of those things that, because it's all electronically controlled, whatever option you select really does change the way this vehicle drives, which also means it's going to be great for a multi-person household. While one person may want the performance model, other people may not be interested in it at all. And if you put that in chill mode, it really does feel like a different car. One of the biggest updates to this vehicle is the fact that we now have a suspension that's adaptive. And that's the first we've seen here in the Model 3. And there is a difference between standard and sport. To my mind, this standard setting feels just as, if not slightly more comfortable than the rest of the Model 3 lineup. And if you want that tighter suspension feel, go ahead and put it in sport and you will definitely get more communicated to you through the suspension. I won't go all the way into the rest of the screen here, but everything is there just like you would expect it on most regular Tesla models. Just like the others, you'll also get a dual charging mat down here below. Obviously, this is my phone and that's my wallet. It's been a bit of an on-the-go sort of day. So the fact that I have 2 bottles here isn't just for reference, it's also because I've had a liquid lunch. You want a little bit more storage? Well, that's going to be found right here. Slide that forward. It is going to be lit inside, and there is pretty good room. This is a small-ish bottle. It will go ahead and stand upright. Push that forward and that'll slide closed. Now, this is not carbon fiber. It's something I would have thought we might see on a performance model, but we don't get it here. As far as I'm concerned, that's okay. There's also going to be a little bit more storage. That's going to be, well, it curves under here. I don't know if you can see that very well, but just enough for, you know, maybe some Kleenex and a few other knickknacks that you may need on the go. One small adjustment is the fact that the key card that comes with the car is no longer going to be tapped here to use. It's going to tap right here where my phone's currently sitting, and that's something I had to go ahead and adjust to, but it's not the only thing I had to adjust to. Let's go ahead and move to the steering wheel. The button layout here on the steering wheel is different than what I'm used to in my 2023 Model 3, because over here on the left we have our turn signals. There's no longer a stalk found here behind the wheel. It's going to be these buttons found inside the wheel. You'll also notice on the right side there's no driver stalk to put it in drive or reverse. That's going to be found up in the top left here of that center screen. That is going to be an adjustment for some, but as soon as you spend, I don't know, maybe 15-20 minutes in the car, you get pretty used to it. Even if it's not my favorite, it's worth noting, but that's going to be up to you whether or not you love, hate, or are pretty indifferent about that certain change. The other thing that's going to change is how you activate your advanced driver assist systems. That's going to be autopilot or full self-driving. Instead of that driver stalk back here, it's going to be button activated here. But basically every other function you may have come to expect from a Tesla is going to be found here, including your voice commands and your wipers. While the rest of this interior feels pretty standard, one thing that is decidedly unique is going to be the seating position, and that's because we get all new exclusive seats to this performance model, and these things are pretty heavily bolstered. Not so much that I don't fit, and for what it's worth, I'm about 6 feet tall and, well, let's say wide enough that I do have difficulty fitting in some bolstered seats, but these ones fit pretty comfortably. Now here in that center is going to be, again, the plaid design, but we don't call this a plaid. Either way, it's a cool look, and these seats come in both black and white. I'm a little disappointed I didn't have a chance to look at the white ones. That's the interior I chose, and I think it would pop with that specific decal. However, these are nice and comfortable. The only difference is that it feels like you're sitting more on top of the car than the last generation, but only ever so slightly. Passengers may not get special sport seats, but they do get plenty of room. This seat is set to where I would have it, which is all the way down and quite a ways back. I am 6 feet tall, and I've got about 2, maybe 3 inches here of legroom, and I also have just enough room to go ahead and stick my feet under the seat. While this is going to be a little bit taller load floor, it is going to be comfortable enough. And as a passenger in the rear, I also have decent control of my environment. Now these vents are going to be just like the front. You go ahead and drag where you want them to stand, but you can also go ahead and turn on your heated seats. You won't be ventilated here in the rear, but you do get heated seats. And for whatever reason, I can't tell you why, I can go ahead and adjust where this front seat is from the rear. Seems like might be a great option if you're driving, Uber or Lyft, but it also seems like a terrible idea if you have your young kids back here and someone in that passenger seat. If you do have kids in the back seat, they'll be pleased to see the 2 USB-C ports you find just under the vents. And these outboard seats are not only heated, but both of them are going to have latch anchors for child seats. There isn't going to be tons of headroom for the rear passenger, but I have to sit all the way upright before I hit that glass ceiling. And the fact that it is glass means that even though I know I'm right there, it doesn't feel nearly as cramped as it does in a lot of other sedans where I fit worse and I don't have a glass ceiling. It doesn't take very long to figure out that this is a lot of fun because there is so much power available in just an instant. And I'll be one of the first to tell you that electric cars are a lot like muscle cars. There's tons of power and they are great in a straight line. What they haven't always been great at is handling. And the Teslas especially are one of those that have always had tons of power, but not always been the greatest when you get them into the corners. And this model has done so much to make that a much better experience. It's still not going to be the most track-oriented driver, but it is going to be so much fun on your back roads, and it's really easily accessible. And by that, I mostly mean that this is pretty affordable. It's very affordable for what it is, but it's also one of the easiest cars to buy. You barely need to talk to anyone. If you want to go to a showroom and you want to drive one, it's available, but if you go on the website, click, 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 and you've basically purchased a very high-performance car. And that's all going to be part of the Tesla experience, not just the buying, but the owning. It's all going to be more removed than a traditional dealership, but that might be what people are looking for. And this driving experience is going to be also very different. I think it is removed from a lot of the conventional things like tachometer and gauges. All of that is basically removed. Obviously a tachometer is not necessary, but the fact that there aren't really any gauges here and all of your information is in one screen is going to be too much of a departure for a lot of automotive enthusiasts. Well, it might enhance the drive, it's hard to say, but it's a different experience because I can focus on the driving and not so much about the couple things that are flashing in front of me. If I want them, they're there, but they're not in my line of sight. My line of sight is the road ahead. If you want to go another bracket higher, we have Polestar 2 performance options, and the BMW i4 M50 would definitely fall into the competition category, but those are starting to get quite a bit pricier, and the Polestar 2 is going to be smaller and less practical for a lot of the same experience. If we focus on those two, just the EV6 and the Ioniq 5, I'll drop the GT in the end just for convenience, then this feels like it's going to slot directly between them. The EV6 is going to feel better around town. It's going to be a little bit more compliant. It's also going to be, I think, a little bit more comfortable, although that depends on how big you are. Because the fact of the matter is that I'm a fairly large person and I fit much better in these seats than I do the EV6, although I do still fit. If you want to turn things up, whether it's to 11 or 12, that's where you're going to want to look at the Ioniq 5. But that's going to be much more compromised on road, on your day-to-day commute, because it's going to be a lot better on the track. At least technically that's my assumption, because Hyundai let us drive the Ioniq 5N on track. Tesla didn't give us anything, just an opportunity to drive it in a showroom. But when you do get the Ioniq 5 on track, or if you're looking for a little bit more fun, and by fun I mean kind of the silly kind, then that's where that's going to really shine, because that's the only car in this grouping that has engine sounds, including backfires when you're decelerating. It's also the only car that fake shifts, and it fake shifts really, really well. And that's a whole lot of fun that you're not going to find in other electric vehicles. So if this slots between them, what does it do well? Well, it's going to be the quickest 0 to 60. It's going to be the quickest on a punch off the line, but it's also going to be comfortable enough for your day-to-day commuting without needing to bring your own back brace to get out after you're done on a spirited backcountry drive. One thing you'll find that the other two don't always have are the creature comforts. If you want all the usable storage that you get in the model, you lose that in the Ioniq 5 because they changed that center console. Is it worth an upgrade from the other Model 3s available? That depends on what you use it for. If you've been an owner of a Model 3 and you find that you really like driving that car hard, you're going to be able to get more out of this one than the other options. But if you're new to electric cars and you want a high performance model, I would make sure you do a really good test drive of the other options before you say, I want the performance model. Because all of these cars have so much more torque than most people are used to, that when you say performance, you just might mean 0 to 60 or passing speed. And you don't necessarily mean carving up the back roads. And the other thing is that the weight distribution, and especially on the all-wheel drive models, the amount of traction you can get in and out of corners is going to be, I think, higher than most of your everyday sedans. That means the non-performance models might be more performance-oriented than you thought they were. How does it line up against the competition? Well, I put together a list of what I think some of the most competitive and comparable models are going to be. And it's not an enormous list because we don't have an enormous list of available electric vehicles, but what we do see is a lot of performance options in the electric vehicle market. You don't see a lot of high-performance RAV4s or CR-Vs, but you do get vehicles like the Ioniq 5, the Mustang Mach-E, that are getting performance models, and honestly, I'm on board with that. Now, the biggest thing that jumps off the list here for me is actually going to be the Model Y performance, because as you can see, it's coming in less expensive than the Model 3. And for those of you that already know, the Model Y is bigger than the Model 3. So here's what's happening there. When the Model 3 got its update earlier this year, it changed pretty drastically over the previous model, at least a lot of stuff happening under the skin. But when the performance model came out, based on this update, there was a bigger differentiation between all the other trims and that performance model. The biggest things being in the suspension category, and that has made a pretty significant difference in the way this rides and honestly the way I feel about it. The Model Y, however, has not received that update, and the performance model of the Model Y is really just a faster version of the Model Y. It's not necessarily a better performance version of said vehicle. So it makes sense to me that it's coming in a little bit less expensive than we find on the Model 3 performance because it's a better performance car. But if you do want to save a few bucks, the Model Y performance is still not a bad way to go. You get more practicality than you do in the Model 3. You still get competitive performance, especially based on everything we have on the list here. And again, saving a few $1,000s is a big thing for a lot of people. So while I won't do a deeper dive into that comparison because they are kind of different generationally, I will say it's still a pretty good deal. I expect though, when we see the updated Model Y, hopefully early in 2025, we'll also see an updated Model Y performance, and that one I expect will come in a little bit more expensive than the Model 3 sibling. Taking a closer look at some of the head-to-head comparisons, the first one I want to pull up is going to be the closest in pricing, and that's going to be with the Mustang Mach-E GT. Though there is a more expensive version of the Mach-E, it's the Rally trim, but that Rally trim is using the same powertrain we get on the GT, and it really is sort of a different kind of performance, more of an off-road oriented option, and the Model 3 performance is not that. So we'll leave that one aside for the moment. But when it comes to pricing, they are very, very close. There are just going to be some differences. And the Mach-E feels more like a regular Mach-E, just a little bit faster. But the big thing you get when you upgrade is not just quicker 0 to 60 time, it's also going to be one of the more comfortable variants of that Mustang, because you do get the top-end suspension, and that can be dialed up or dialed down to handle the different conditions you're driving in. And if you put that in comfort mode, it's going to be one of the more comfortable ways to drive a Mustang around. And having both performance and comfort, to me, is never really a bad thing. The biggest difference here is going to be that the Model 3 is going to be a better performance car. It's going to handle better in the corners. It's going to be quicker 0 to 60, but it's going for two very different aesthetics as well. While the Model 3 is going on the sleek and sexy end, the Mustang Mach-E, while not a true Mustang, is still going for a pony car vibe with a bit of a wagon flair. And honestly, if I were to pick between the two just aesthetically, it gets really, really tough for me to decide. And right now I'm just not going to. I do appreciate that you get some more customization there on the Mustang, different colors, different wheels, and the Model 3 is pretty standard like you get in the rest of the Tesla lineup. But between those two, just know that the Mach-E maybe isn't the better deal, but if one of those speaks to you, there's not really a wrong way to go. On the performance side of things, the closest competitor is going to be the Ioniq 5N, which is an Ioniq 5 turned all the way up. And here's where things get a little bit trickier, because on paper, the Model 3 is quicker at 0 to 60, but 0 to 60 times do not a performance car make. It does mean that it's going to be quicker off the line, but if you want to talk about around a track, that Ioniq 5N is definitely going to be the better option. But here's my question, is how often are you going to find yourself on a track? And how much are you willing to sacrifice for a higher performance vehicle, especially when it comes to an affordable one? Because here's how things generally shake out. When you go for a higher performance model, you get things like stiffer suspension. But that stiffer suspension also means a rougher ride, unless you pay a lot of money to get a very variable suspension, a very good variable suspension. And that costs a lot more money than we're going to be paying here in something like that Ioniq 5N. But it is going to be more fun. So if spirited drives are your thing, if you're willing to have a bumpier ride for a higher performance, more contact patch with the road, and you want to have a ton of fun with a vehicle that sounds like it's a gas vehicle, that has pops and burbles, that will fake shift for you, that Ioniq 5N is absolutely the way to go. But some of the other creature comforts you're missing are unfortunate, because you are going to be getting the performance seat. But that seat is going to be pretty comfortable and supportive as long as you fit in it. And honestly, I do, but just barely. And you're also going to be losing things like the powered controls, the memory seating. The dashboard does change just a little bit. And you're also going to be losing quite a bit of efficiency on that particular trim versus the other Ioniq 5s. And while you do get a drop in efficiency on the Model 3, it's not nearly as severe, but it's also not nearly as dedicated to a performance model. So when it comes to your everyday driving, that Model 3 might be a better fit for you. But if everyday driving isn't your biggest concern, or you are willing to make those sacrifices, then I would definitely go with an Ioniq 5N, because it's going to scream performance car visually as well, because it is much more aggressive, drastic, bombastic in the way that it screams its aesthetic than the Model 3, which is definitely going to be a little bit more, maybe mature, but also maybe a little bit more bland. Again, that's going to be up to you, but if I was renting a car for a week, I would absolutely pick an Ioniq 5N. If I was buying it, that's where things get a little bit tighter. Those other two models are good competitive options, but I think the closest comparison comes from Kia, and that's going to be in the EV6 GT, which is the top-end trim, but also the highest performance trim. Sometimes the top-end trim is a luxury variant, but this one is not, and you are going to get some performance upgrades. It's the quickest 0 to 60, though it is going to come in a few tenths of a second slower than you find in the Model 3. It's going to get different wheel and tire packages. It comes with different braking, more intense braking, and the overhaul is not going to make it so that everyday driving is uncomfortable, but it is going to be a little bit tighter, and that's what people are looking for when they're looking for a performance trim. The interior also gets a small overhaul. It does have a sportier vibe to it, including things like the sport seat, and that sport seat is one that honestly you're going to need to go make sure that you fit comfortably in it, because it's much less adjustable than you find in the regular seat and a lot of other seats on the market. You're also now going to be going to manual adjustments. So if you do swap cars with someone in the house or a friend or a partner, then just understand you're going to be doing a lot more work when you switch between different drivers than you would in a lot of other options, including that Model 3, which is going to have memory seating. But I think Kia has done a really good job of finding a balance between the base vehicle and the performance upgrade, because you don't really lose a whole lot. There is going to be some loss in efficiency, and that's kind of to be expected and pretty typical when you go to a higher performance car. You also are going to lose, I think, a little bit of that comfort, especially when it comes to those seating adjustability. But again, if you fit in that seat, it's going to be a nice, supportive, and comfortable ride. But you still get the practicality of that EV6. And you still get things that the Kia offers that Tesla doesn't, which is going to be things like top-end charging speed, because this is going to be one of the faster charging vehicles on the market for quite a while. And that's because of its 800-volt architecture, where Tesla is still using 400-volt even in this performance model. I think the biggest gap between these models on paper is not the 0 to 60 time, it's actually the paper you have to fork out to purchase them. But if the Kia EV6 is speaking to you, then I don't think it's an unreasonable price to pay for that option versus something like the Model 3, which honestly is a very good value. And I think that's one of the strongest points we get in the Tesla, is that it is really affordable, all things considered. Those considerations cover a pretty wide range. When you look at your everyday drivability, this is just like a regular Model 3. Though it might ride a little bit tighter, it's still a much better suspension than we found in the last generation. And you're not losing any space on the inside, so you still get lots of room in the front seats, back seats, and the storage area, even though this isn't an enormous sedan. The other thing we get for everyday use is going to be these upgraded seats, and they're really comfortable. And sometimes a sport seat is very supportive, but not always the most comfortable. So you're not losing anything from the daily drivability standpoint, at least not really. On the performance end of things, it's done a good job of giving you, like I said, the quickest vehicle on this list, 0 to 60, just under 3 seconds. And that's what people are looking for more often than not. If straight line speed isn't enough for you, you do get a little bit of aero treatment, some better wheels and tires, and a better suspension. So it doesn't just feel like a juiced up Tesla, it does feel like a different, distinct performance model. While I do probably think this is the best bang for the buck option, it doesn't mean it's the definitive performance EV. And there are going to be a few things missing from it. Frankly, I do wish Tesla had turned it up even higher, because I feel like they are fully capable of doing so. And it's a little weird to me that they put the performance badging, the plaid badge, even though they don't call this a plaid model. So maybe there is a plaid model on the way that you can do a little bit more tuning, a little bit more adjustment to make it an even higher performance model. And I mean performance out on the track, because that's where I'd love to see some of these EVs shine. And one of the downsides that we're going to get that we see in the Ioniq 5N is the ability for that car to go out and do some serious track time and then come back and charge and get back out on track very, very quickly. And the Model 3 isn't going to be able to charge as fast. And what we don't know, and what I suspect it doesn't have, is the same kind of cooling improvements that we see over there on the Hyundai to make it an option or a viable option for people to go ahead and do that. Which just means that if you want to push your car harder, this one's going to fade out faster than something like that Ioniq 5 does. And if you're coming from another performance car, maybe EV, maybe not, you might not be interested in the layout that Tesla offers, especially with this particular model that went ahead and got rid of things like driver stocks. So no putting in drive here behind the steering wheel, no adjustments for your windshield wipers there. All of that's going to be done on the touchscreen, and I do think that's going to be a big no for a lot of people. The last thing for me is available options, and there are not a lot of available options here on the Tesla. You get to pick a color, inside, one of 2, outside, one of 6, 7, and then your wheel and tire combination is pretty much already decided for you. When people buy a performance car, they really do like to spend a little bit more time making it their own, and Tesla just doesn't really offer that. One thing really missing from the catalog is I wish we saw something like the yoke steering wheel from the Model S brought over to the Model 3, at least just as an option. And I'm not saying make it standard, but if you want to feel like you are taking your Tesla to the absolute limit, give us the fun steering wheel so we can play with it a little bit more. That's all I've got on the Model 3 Performance. Let me know down in the comment section below, is this the vehicle that you would be chasing for your next performance electric car, or did one of these other options spark your interest a little bit more than the Tesla? And if there's one that I missed, let me know down there as well. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you down the road.